Hey everybody, Steve Kosniewski here. As usual, the technology is not agreeing with me, so I'm using my phone, despite the fact that I have all this excellent audio-visual technology for my computer, but I can never seem to get it work for my Facebook Lives. Anyway, I lost the page I was on and everything. Let us start with a brief reading, which I literally just did, but apparently for nobody, because I wasn't broadcasting, from The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson. If I can find where I was. Yes, here it is. So this is probably one of my favorite parts of the novel. And we'll give it a minute for everybody to come in, and they'll come in and they'll say, oh, he's, reading the story out loud. So if you come in and you hear me, leave a comment, let me know that you can hear me, and we'll do this brief recitation, and then we'll start talking about the book. Suddenly, I hear a sound out in the gardens. How it thrills through me. It is approaching. Pad, pad, pad. A prickly sensation traverses my spine and seems to creep across my scalp. The dog moves in his kennel and whimpers frightenedly. He must have turned round, for now I can no longer see the outline of his shining wound. Outside, the gardens are silent once more, and I listen fearfully. A minute passes, and another. Then I hear the padding sound again. It is quite close, and appears to be coming down the graveled path. The noise is curiously measured and deliberate. It ceases outside the door, and I rise to my feet and stand motionless. From the door comes a slight sound. The latch is being slowly raised. A singing noise is in my ears, and I have a sense of pressure about the head. The latch drops with a sharp click into the catch. The noise startles me afresh, jarring horribly on my tense nerves. After that, I stand for a long while amid an ever-growing quietness. All at once, my knees begin to tremble, and I have to sit quickly. An uncertain period of time passes, and gradually I begin to shake off the feeling of terror that has possessed me. Yet still I sit. I seem to have lost the power of movement. I am strangely tired and inclined to doze. My eyes open and close, and presently I find myself falling asleep and waking in fits and starts. It is some time later that I am sleepily aware that one of the candles is guttering. When I wake again, it has gone out, and the room is very dim, under the light of the one remaining flame. The semi-darkness troubles me little. I have lost that awful sense of dread, and my only desire seems to be to sleep. Suddenly, although there is no noise, I am awake, wide awake. I am acutely conscious of the nearness of some mystery, of some overwhelming presence. The very air seems pregnant with terror. I sit huddled and just listen intently. Still, there is no sound. Nature herself seems dead. Then the oppressive stillness is broken by a little eldritch scream of wind that sweeps round the house and dies away remotely. And that's just a little excerpt from The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson. A classic of, I think Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft said a classic of the first water. It's kind of an old-fashioned way of saying things. I apologize for those of you just tuning in. I had everything all set up. Now the light's not great because I ended up having to use my phone. So maybe we'll try and use some real light instead of artificial light. Maybe that'll work better. Yeah, this is what happens when you got live video, everybody. That's a little better. Guess I look kind of like I'm living in darkness here, but oh God, let's try this. Okay, So, The House on the Borderland, that's what you all tuned in to talk about. So, I actually first came across this novel when I was very, very young. And some of you won't remember this, others of you will, but they used to have these book clubs and CD clubs. Like some of you were probably involved with, I think it was called Columbia House, where they'd be like, we'll send you 15 CDs a month for like $12 for like the first year. And then after that, of course, all the prices go up astronomically. And then you're locked into this club and you're paying, hundreds of dollars a month for CDs unless you opt out. And like that's the trick how they get you is they send it to you unless you opt out. Anyway, I got involved with a book club that was like this. I think it was like the Science Fiction and Fantasy Book Club, something like that. And one of the books that I ended up getting was Barlow's Guide to Fantasy. So this is probably 1996, 1997 that we're talking. Yeah, November 1996, first printing. So Wayne Douglas Barlow is an artist, and he did a guide to fantasy, guide to science fiction, and I think a guide to hell. So you can see he's this really cool artist, and he does these paintings of, fantastical creatures from books and novels and legends and that kind of thing. And one of the creatures that I remember from this book is the swine thing. So this is Barlow's conception of the swine things from the House on the Borderland. And he just has alongside it just a little description, because obviously as an artist, he's much more interested in what the creature looks like. So, he talks a little bit about the story, but mostly you're just seeing this, beautiful painting of these creatures. So I knew the swine thing from Barlow's Guide to Fantasy many, many moons ago. I had not read The House on the Borderland. And in fact, this vague little memory of, a picture out of a book that I read when I was like 14, had fallen into, disrepair and disuse, and I'd much forgotten about it. Then a few years ago, you can tell, actually I'm wearing the t-shirt, I listened pretty religiously and actually appeared a couple of times on The Horror Show with Brian Keene, which was, at the time, I venture to say, the preeminent horror podcast in the world. So people would kind of listen to what Brian was talking about, and that would kind of be the subject of the week. Brian and Dave Thomas, our dear departed friend Dave Thomas. And a few years ago, they chose The House on the Borderland as a book club selection. So I think it was probably every month, or maybe less regular than that. They would pick a book for some reason, and that would be the book club selection. And then they would give people, 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever to read the book, and then they would have a spoilery discussion about it. So, it would be things like Primitive by J.F. Gonzalez, because, Gonzalez had passed away. Or it might be something that was particularly hot in the zeitgeist right now, like at the time, A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. The House on the Borderland was selected as sort of, I don't want to say forgotten classic, because the more I talk about it and the more that I kind of, pimp this book as much as I, reasonably can, I don't know that it's forgotten. I think a lot of people have actually read it, but even so, with every generation, you lose readers, and I had never read it. So growing up, I tell this story pretty consistently. I just told it the other day to my partner, I think. Or no, I'm sorry. It was on another podcast. It was with Crystal Bainham, and I'll be sharing that podcast shortly on all of my social media. I was not allowed to watch horror. So again, this was during the 80s and the 90s. And my mother, who was, and I assume still is, a fucking lunatic, this was at the height of the satanic panic. And so everything to her was a slasher. If anything was horror, it was slasher. So we had to hear about how we weren't allowed to watch, Gremlins or Psycho. Or, I mean, I guess Psycho is kind of a slasher. But her whole conception of what horror was at this time was that it was either Freddy and Jason. That's all that horror was. So I wasn't allowed to read horror. I wasn't allowed to watch horror. And kind of to my detriment today, as I find out. So, a lot of times, my friends will be talking about, oh, I've seen Phantasm 14 times. And I'll be like, I just discovered it this year. Or, I wasn't allowed to watch A Nightmare on Elm Street. I just watched it. I watched the original Nightmare on Elm Street last year around this time, I think. So in a lot of ways, I'm playing catch up on something that everybody else, it has been like an integral part of their lives since they were children. So I feel like a little bit of an outsider. But the one saving grace of this, I was always interested in dark fiction and weird fiction, but the way that I kind of got around my parents' insane restrictions was we were kind of always allowed to read classics. So anything that was considered a classic, I could read. And because it wasn't a quote-unquote slasher, it didn't matter how violent or dark or macabre it was, I was allowed to read it. So I, consumed all of Poe, and that was great because it was a classic. And all of Lovecraft, Frankenstein, and Dracula. And, I would think that The House on the Borderland would be the sort of thing I would have read back then, but I didn't. I didn't really dive too deeply into some of those earlier weird tales. Like, I've been getting into it now, like Algernon Blackwood and Art Machen, who rhymes with Dokken, and people like that. But I am still very familiar with that era and with that style of writing. So you could hear from the excerpt I heard, it's a very, it's an acquired taste. It's something you sort of have to train, I would say, your ear or your eyes, however you want to look at it. Train yourself as a reader to be able to read that kind of gothic 19th century style. Now, that being said, technically speaking, The House on the Borderland is actually a 20th century tale. It came out in 1908. Nevertheless, in reading it, it feels very much more of a piece with the 19th century Gothic stuff. In the style, in the subject matter to an extent. Now, that being said, it's an interesting title, The Borderland, because obviously there is a, I don't want to say literal term that Hodgson is using here, but there is a in-universe reason why it's The House on the Borderland. But this novel itself is also very much kind of on the borderland between the Gothic style, when all that people really understood was physically ghosts and monsters and hauntings and that kind of thing, and the weird cosmic and what would later be called, Lovecraftian style of Lovecraft and those writers of his circle in the early 1920s, 1930s. This is kind of a bridge between those different styles, I find. So, like I said, book is released in 1908. Hodgson is a young man. He dies in World War One, so I think 1918 or so. I'm not a Hodgson biographer. I just kind of know what happened in his life. So here's what I know about Hodgson. He's this young man. He's what we would call today a Renaissance man. He's a writer. He's great at writing. He's an athlete. He's extremely athletic. Very, very well known for being strong and good at sports and that kind of thing. He's written a few things, and then his life is cut abruptly short. I think when he's probably late 20s, 30s. So we can only imagine what else he would have produced afterwards. But let's talk about what he did produce. So Hodgson, obviously, The House on the Borderland is kind of this standalone work of genius. That it's kind of like I've heard people say about The Who, if they had never released anything other than I Can't Explain, we would still be talking about them today. Which I think is probably, in the actuality of it, more how we talk about like the Trogs, because they did Wild Thing. This is kind of how I like to think of The House on the Borderland. If this was the only thing William Hope Hodgson had ever produced, we would still be talking about him today to some extent. He also did Carnacki the Ghost Finder. And Carnacki the Ghost Finder is... it's similar to Sherlock Holmes. So it's a series of short stories featuring this character, Thomas Carnacki. And Carnacki, I think he, by inclination, is a skeptic. And so a couple of the Carnacki stories, Carnacki is brought in because he's legendarily, he's the Ghostbuster of this age. And some of the Carnacki stories, Carnacki's brought in and he's like, oh yeah, this is all fake. They were faking it, and here's how, and here's where the light source was. Like the kind of thing like you or I or any of us jaded people today would like immediately figure out. But then a couple of the Carnacki stories, there are actually ghosts. So I think while Carnacki is by nature a skeptic, he has learned to accept the fact that there is supernatural stuff and that he's kind of the guy that's on the hook to take care of it because he's well known as the Ghost Finder. So like I said, they are similar in style to Sherlock Holmes, but the Holmes stories, there was always an explanation. Even if something like the Hound of the Baskervilles or whatever appeared to be spiritual, it never turned out that way in the end. With Carnacki, sometimes it did. So Carnacki was kind of like his Hodgson's kind of like sexy, famous character. He also did the Ghost Pirates, and it's fine. I didn't really hate the Ghost Pirates. It was interesting. And the Boats of the Glen Carrig, and the Boats of the Glen Carrig, I mean, I don't want to completely dismiss the Ghost Pirate, but this isn't really like a story. We're not really talking about the Ghost Pirates today. And I know you could get somebody on here that's like an expert in weird fiction, an expert on Hodgson, who could probably talk about the Ghost Pirates for an hour. But to me, it was kind of like, okay, here's Hodgson's take at a more sincere kind of ghost story. And yeah, it certainly had some of the weird elements that he became famous for, but it didn't really rock my world. There's the Boats of the Glen Carrig, and that was kind of where you see his development as an author. From the Ghost Pirates to House on the Borderland, I think the Boats of the Glen Carrig is kind of in the center. So it's a shipwreck, and there's some very strange, what would later be looked at as weird fiction business, thinking mold and this kind of thing. And then finally there's the Nightland, which do not waste your fucking time unless you've just got like tons of time and you hate yourself. So the Nightland, interestingly enough, I think the Nightland appears in the House on the Borderland. So we'll talk about the House on the Borderland in a second here. There's a lot of time travel in this story. So the recluse, the main character of the House on the Borderland, he lives in a house and there are strange happenings going on around him, but he also spends a lot of his time astral projecting kind of against his will and mostly into the future. And the things that he is watching, if you pay close attention, the world advances to Hodgson's The Nightlands. So what The Nightlands is about is kind of an early post-apocalyptic tale. And there's this enormous pyramid, and that's it. That's the last pyramid of humanity. It's the only place where humans exist and are free to be humans. And then surrounding this pyramid, and I think there was all this. This is kind of the interesting thing, and this is one of the reasons why I was saying earlier, I'll tend to lump Hodgson in with the 19th century authors, because a lot of the science that he talks about is all this old-timey exploded science, like fire is made up of fire particles called phlogiston, or like reading the skull to determine how a person is. Some of that kind of science makes its way into his books. So in the Nightlands, things are powered by energy sources that aren't real and that kind of thing. So everybody who's still a human lives in this pyramid, and then surrounding that is the Nightlands, and it's filled with monsters, and I guess it's kind of implied mutants, like things that used to be human that now wander the Nightlands. And however, while that sounds really cool, and I think it would be really cool if somebody did a remake or a revision and made it like cool and short, I believe Hodgson was being paid by the word with that book, and you can tell. Because every time that he can use 10 words to get across one idea that could have just been one word, he will. And it is this immense, just ponderous tome. Like, if you're the kind of person that didn't like Lord of the Rings because they spent too much time walking, this is a book where all they do is walking. And while there's, like, interesting ideas, that's about it in the Nightlands. It wasn't like a thrilling story. It was like the most boring travelogue you've ever read. Like, I woke up in the morning and I made breakfast, because again, he was writing for pay. And then there's also this very early 20th century. He sort of puts a lampshade on it, because he says that the main character actually astral projected from like the 17th century. But the main character is wildly sexist. And when he meets up with the, like, quote-unquote love of his life, all he does is berate her for being a woman, and is constantly like, oh, you silly woman, let me smack you around like a housewife in the 50s, and is constantly telling her she's, like, too stupid to exist and just needs to, listen to him and that kind of thing. So the Nightlands appears in the House on the Borderland during one of the time travel jaunts, as far as I can tell, which is pretty cool. And this is also something that they were not doing back in those days. So I'm sure Hodgson wouldn't have had the idea of a shared universe. He was probably just interested in those ideas, wasn't sure if he was going to get to write the entirety of the Nightland, and put some of those ideas into the House on the Borderland. I'm sure that's what actually happened. But when you know his entire milieu, that makes the House on the Borderland even more interesting. So anyway, like I said, I reread this book every year. I have not gone back to revisit any of the other books because they don't hold the interest. Meanwhile, this one, I get something different out of it every time I read it. So, to put it in short, there is a framing story, and then there is the actual manuscript called The House on the Borderland. So, the framing story is, I guess we're meant to believe it's present day, which for them would have been 1907, 1908. And there's these two guys, and they're just like these kind of frat bro guys, Baranog and Tonneson. And they are going on a fishing holiday to the imaginary town of Creighton, Ireland. So they're just kind of, like I said, they're just kind of these frat bros, and like, yeah, cool. Let's go fishing, bro. Yeah, all right, man. They go to the most remote part of Ireland. So I guess we take it that these guys are English. And in this very, very remote part of Ireland, nobody speaks English. So they all speak Irish, or think he calls it Gaelic in the book. I'm not really sure what the correct term is. I think Irish is the correct term now. So they go to this town where nobody speaks English, and they're kind of looking down on the locals, the Irish. And then they go out and they go on their fishing journey. And they're following the river, and the river just suddenly stops, which is very strange. Like, rivers don't just suddenly stop. And they find the ruins of this decrepit old house. And they both have this serious, like, fucking tension. Like, they are physically immediately repulsed by the house. But, you know, they're like frat bros, like, yeah, I'm not scared. Yeah, I'm not scared either. So they go into the house and they find, well, it's the ruins. They just kind of go into the ruins. And they find this manuscript, which is the House on the Borderland. And they both kind of like they're in a cartoon, like kind of back away from the house. And they're like, okay, let's look at this manuscript. So they pull out the manuscript, and then the real story starts. And we have this character who goes unnamed throughout the entire story, who's referred to in outside sources as the Recluse. There's no reason to call him anything else. And I actually can't even remember I think Baranog and Tonneson don't call him that. I think they just call him the narrator or something, you know, the writer of the manuscript. So I think the Recluse is a term that scholars use, readers use. Because I just read it, and I actually don't recall anybody calling him the Recluse within. But you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you're a better Hodgson scholar than I am. So they find this manuscript, and it's this guy who's about 100 years ago. So we take it to be 1807, 1808. So like the Georgian era, the era of like Jane Austen, that kind of thing. And this guy, he hates the Irish too. Okay, so it's kind of an interesting thing for Baranog and Thomason to be like, oh, we look down on the Irish locals. And this guy's like, yeah, I bought this mansion, and those fucking peasants, just like, I fucking hate them. I just don't want to be near them. So it's kind of an interesting little dig of sorts there. Excuse me. So the Recluse lives essentially alone in this mansion in a foreign land, with his sister, who he is his housekeeper. So we gather he's old. He's probably meant to be in his 60s. In fact, I think he says he's in his 60s. And so his sister's probably also in her 60s. So she's what would have been considered a spinster or an old maid back in those days, because she's clearly not married or anything. So she just kind of lives with her brother. She has a cat, which I think is not mentioned until like the last chapter or something, when he's just like, and my sister had a cat. However, the Recluse has a dog, Pepper, who is like his most beloved companion. And he's like, yeah, whatever, my sister, who I've known all my life, sure, whatevs. But Pepper's my boy. So he's writing this story, and he early on starts to astral project. I mean, this is my term. This is not the term that Hodgson uses, but it's how we would recognize it. So his version of astral projecting is pretty much that he's advancing into the future. So he doesn't really know what's going on. He's not trying to do it. He's not like a wizard or anything. He's just like this grumpy, nasty old man. But one night he wakes up and he's astral projecting. And in the far future, he thinks, he still sees his house. However, his house is now made of, I think it was jade or emerald. But everything around it is different. And it's surrounded with these pagan gods. Now, regarding religion in this book, and by the way, if you guys have any comments or questions, go ahead and put them in. I'd rather have a discussion than a didactic thing, but because I'd like to hear your thoughts about religion. I mean, anything really in this book. So he mentions reading the Bible, but he doesn't describe it as like my sacred text or anything. He calls it like that great old book, the Bible. So we take it to mean that he has some reverence for the Bible, but not that he's a religious guy. He certainly doesn't go to church. He ran off to live in the woods to get away from people. The only times he mentions Christ and that kind of thing, but the impression I get is that he's just kind of Christian in the sense that anybody in 1908 would have been like, yes, I come from a good Christian household. But he's not really about his religion. He never talks about the religion. He doesn't really cry out to God very often. Like, sometimes he does, but it doesn't seem like he's like, oh, God, deliver me from this. Sometimes he'll be like, almost just like an exclamation, like, God, why have you done this to me? So he doesn't seem like a particularly religious guy. And he also doesn't immediately go to seek like religious help. Like, you would think a guy in this situation who's gone into the future and seen a bunch of horrible happenings would want to go talk to a priest or something. Anyway, my impression, and it may just entirely be a Kosniewski thing, is that he is not religious. I don't know. So, in any case, this is about as religious as he gets in this period. Is he recognizes that all of the statues are of pagan gods. And then he's like, I recognize these things as like Egyptian and African gods and stuff. He's like, I wonder if that means that they were in some greater sense real and that other people recognized them. Which, again, is not something that I feel like a guy of that era would necessarily think, especially if he was religious. So he's in this future place. He's in this place he calls the arena. It's surrounded by the statues of the pagan gods. And he sees his house, an emerald or jade version of his house. And he understands that he's traveled through time. He doesn't entirely understand all the elements of it, of like what exactly has transpired. But he understands that he's traveled through time and possibly space, but that his house is in some way a constant. So he's starting to get the impression that his house, the house on the borderland, is some kind of thing that exists in different times and different realities, and that he has stumbled into it. That he is probably not the caretaker that was intended for this house. So, like, in stories of this era, we're usually meant to understand that places and objects and artifacts of great importance are guarded and watched over. And if they are not guarded, it's because they've been abandoned by their guards, and that can be a very, very bad thing. But the house on the borderland just seems like this place that he's kind of accidentally stumbled into with a greater cosmic significance. He doesn't know what it is. But what he does know is, amongst all the pagan gods, there's one that he does not recognize, and it's this pig god, this swine god. So you remember we showed you Barlow's feeling. Now, this is not how the swine god, or I think Karnaki came across it in one of the Karnaki stories as well. So there's more of that cross-universal stuff. So this is what the swine things look like, according to Barlow. But this is not what the hog or the swine god looks like. It is this far superior, porcine deity thing. So he sees this thing, and he catches its attention. So now he's attracted the attention of this pig god while astral projecting, which he's like, oh shit, I done fucked up. But he doesn't know what he's doing. He just kind of goes back to 1808 with his sister and his dog. And he's like, oh, well, thank God, that's all taken care of. So then, over the course of the next few days, this story, which up until now, like I said, there's the framing device with the frat bros who find the manuscript. And then there's this guy who's just a grumpy guy. He's like, fuck everything. I ran away to the forest because I didn't want to deal with people. And then he starts astral projecting, we gather, accidentally. Because like I said, he never makes any indications that he's a wizard or an occultist or anything like that. It seems like something that's just kind of happened to him by hook or by crook. Now, he comes back to the present day, and he starts to hear snuffling and things around his house and in his garden. And it turns out there's a great pit underneath the house. And there's great dense forests, and there's all kinds of scary shit that he just hadn't really been paying attention to. And slowly, all the snufflings and freakouts and stuff turn out to be not just one swine thing, but an entire army of swine things. So like I said, they're clearly connected to the pig god, the hog, or whatever you want to call it. They're clearly his, servants in some sense. But all they're really interested in is breaking into the house and attacking the recluse and presumably his sister and breaking in and ripping him out. Because we've gathered at this point that the house on the borderland has some kind of greater cosmic significance. So they want him out. And so he has a shotgun and he has pepper and he's running around like a crazy person, and that'll become important in a second. I chose my words wisely there. He's running around like a crazy person, trying to defend his house from what in modern day we would look at as like a home invasion story, like Gremlins or Critters or something like that. Like a tower defense, or like what was the John Lynch movie? Precinct 8 or something, where it's just like attacks. So he's fighting off the swine things, and he gathers that he can hurt them, and he understands that they are the servants of the swine god, but they're not like divine or powerful or potent, because he can hurt them and he can chase them off. And ultimately, he does. And the swine things seem to kind of go, like, they're like, okay, we're not going to win this fight. You've got a shotgun and you keep your doors locked and you kind of chase us off every night. So they kind of retire to the dark recesses of the pit. And he goes into the pit looking for them. And this is another one of the most thrilling parts of the book, is he takes pepper and he takes a bunch of candles, because it's like 1808, and the shotgun, and he goes and he's descending into this pit. So, like I said, you can see where this influences Gremlins. You can see where it influences The Descent. You can see where it clearly influences Lovecraft. It's such an influential novel. To imagine that all of this was going on in this thin, I think it's maybe 50,000 words story, released, 120 years ago from our perspective. So, anyway, to sum up the rest of the story with the recluse, the swine things go off, but they seem to regroup, less than run away. So I think they decided, anyway, this is where it's not 100% clear in the text what's going on, but I'm intuiting this. So first of all, at this point, now that he's been under attack, now that his home has almost been ransacked, the recluse admits why he doesn't just run away. And it turns out that he has been seeing the love of his life appearing as a ghost in his dreams at night, in what he calls the Sea of Sleep, which he describes it as like a literal ocean, but that he sees in his dreams, and then he meets his ex-wife, ex-girlfriend, long-lost love, whatever, on this beach, and they spend their nights together. So we gather that he has been astral projecting in his dreams a little bit, seeing his wife, who he for some reason is convinced this is real, this is really, really, really her, and not just a dream. And then that's probably some element of that is what kicked off the original astral projection, where he went very, very, very much awry and landed in the arena and met the hog. Which is also all probably connected to the House on the Borderland being this place that exists in all places and all times. And I forget if it's at this point or... Oh, yeah, it's probably later. So we find out that this is why he doesn't leave. And then he starts astral projecting again. And this time is when he is aware that he's projecting into the future. And he's watching everything that's happening around him. So he's just sort of looking out the window, and he sees it turns from night to day, night to day, night to day. And it keeps doing that, and suddenly years are passing, and thousands of years are passing. Now, this is the part where I mentioned earlier, we see the Nightlands, we see the pyramid rising and the Nightlands experiencing. So he watches as that happens, and that's kind of neat for people who've read the Nightlands, although I do not read the Nightlands. It's fucking horrible. He sees all of this happening, and then he sees the sun go supernova. And I think he described it a different way, because again, this is that old-fashioned science that doesn't make sense anymore. He describes it turning green, which I guess is what they thought would eventually happen to the sun, was that it would turn green and then go out or something. And on this trip is when he watches the House on the Borderland again, and it's under assault by the swine things again, in a different time and place. And he realizes that the hog's intention is really to take out the House on the Borderland. Like, that can't still be there. So throughout all these times, he was just kind of there in the wrong place. And when he caught the hog's attention, it sent its followers against him in the distant past. So he's kind of just caught up in all of this stuff. Like, I've heard people say, like, how are these things all connected? And I'm like, if you read between the lines, you'll understand that like I said, if it's not all presented to you chronologically, but once you're aware that he's been seeing his wife in his dreams, and that seems to be some version of astral projecting, and then he does the bad astral projection, and he catches the eyes of the swine god, and then it sets its servants upon him in the past, and then he comes back and he goes back to astral projecting again. It all actually does kind of hold together as a story. But I also want to talk about that for a second. So he goes into the distant future, and Pepper, his beloved dog, turns to dust. Because for some reason, and this is where things kind of fall apart, of course, he's going into the future, and I guess because he's special in some way, or he's been affected by the house. He doesn't die, but Pepper collapses into dust. And now he's despondent. He's lost his only friend, blah, blah, blah. He thinks he's at the end of the universe, and that's it. He's seen everything. He's lost his life. He was only in his 60s, but whatever else was left is forfeit now because he's too old and feeble and brittle to move. Then he returns back in time to his modern day and his modern self. But Pepper is still reduced to ash. So it's almost like, again, he's doing the astral projecting and he's paying the prices every time that he does, whether it was deliberate or not, which he consistently says he's not doing it deliberately, but he also wants to see his wife every night, so he probably is trying to control it to some extent. So now Pepper's gone, and now we're back to, so kind of in the stages that this story goes, which is, nothing much is happening, then there's some astral projection, then there's some consequences for the astral projection in the real world, then there's some astral projection again, then there's consequences again. We're back to one of the consequences things. And this time, it doesn't seem like there's swine things. There only seems to be one thing. And it is swine-like. And we think probably, my suspicion anyway, is that the hog itself, or some kind of avatar of the god itself, has decided to descend upon this time and this place and take a personal interest in the recluse. My neck is just tingling just talking about this. This guy, just for being lonely, has invited the wrath of some fantastical entity onto his doorstep. And so, the last few chapters of the book, he's gotten a new dog, and the dog has been attacked by some kind of pig creature, but not a swine thing, not just a regular swine thing. And it's starting to turn into a fungus, which kind of harkens back to the Boats of the Glencarrig, which was one of his earlier stories, and also projects forward into like the fungi from Yuggoth and all the sort of stuff that Lovecraft would do later with the horrible molds and funguses and things. So this second dog, the dog he doesn't care about, he repeatedly says, I don't care about this dog, I just lock him outside. I want a dog in case there are more swine things. This dog's turning into a mushroom. And then he starts turning into a mushroom. And then the last thing we have in this story is something's outside his door, knocking and trying to get in. And then the story ends abruptly. And this is, like I said, it's a little bit old-fashioned language. If you can get past that, even having read this 6 or 7 times and knowing exactly what's going to happen, I still get terrified reading it, picking it up. And if you get into that space, if you get into that liminal space, it is fucking terrifying. So it's a great book. But one of the things, now I mentioned, every time that I read this, I take away something different. And one of the things that I've been taking away more recently, so then there's the closing piece. So this is not super important, but it is important to the discussion I want to have next. So this time, we actually go back to the framing story, which was one of the things that pissed me off about the Nightlands was, in the Nightlands, he introduced this framing story of these 17th century fucking guys that go into the future, and then just fucking drops it. In House on the Borderland, he actually goes back to the framing story, to the frat bros, Baranog and Tonneson. So they've finished reading the manuscript that they found in what we presume is the ruins of the House on the Borderland, which in itself, if you've read this manuscript, is scary, because you now know that the fucking gates are unmanned, the hog is out there, and he succeeded in destroying the House on the Borderland that was frustrating his will throughout all spaces and times, right? So we go back to these guys, and they're like, what the fuck was this? Was this real? And they run around, and again, there's kind of this whole thing about being a stranger in a strange land, where they're English, they're in Ireland, where nobody there speaks English. And they kind of look down upon these people. There's that whole undercurrent of this story. So they get their driver to find out if any of this happens. And the driver's like, I don't know, man, but the oldest guy in the village says there was indeed a place that they all said the devil lived at, and there was indeed a guy, and nobody really much knows what happened to him. So we know essentially that it's not fiction. It is a real diary, but everything else is left up to the imagination. So, and the only other thing that we know is that they're both, again, very frightened to go to the house on the borderland. So the way that I look at this story is, and I understand why Hodgson used a framing device for this. There is no reason whatsoever given in the text to question Baranog or Tonneson. So when they are, everything they say we can assume can be taken at face value. They just don't have very much to say to shed light on the supernatural events. But we know there was a real place. We know the place is not there anymore. We know there was a real dude with his real sister, not there anymore, met some kind of horrible end. I mean, obviously it was 100 years ago. But Baranog and Tonneson, they are there to show that this all, something happened. Something happened, and it happened here. Now, as for the recluse, as for the manuscript itself, we are given every reason in the world to question it. In fact, the only reason we don't write him off immediately as completely mad is that Baranog and Tonneson discovered the ruins of this place. So something weird destroyed this place, and there's a river that just disappears. So, and they feel weird and hinky when they go into this place. So, I'm inclined, the more that I read it, to dismiss the recluse as being totally mad. So I want to read to you actually the first line of the story. It's the first line in the actual diary, in theory. So he says, I am an old man. I live here in this ancient house, surrounded by huge unkempt gardens. The peasantry, who inhabit the wilderness beyond, say that I am mad. That is because I will have nothing to do with them. So I think right off the bat here, Hodgson is kind of giving away the game. And he even says in the author's note, something along the lines of, whatever you get out of this story, I hope you have a rollicking good time, but, take out of this story what you will, basically. He says it, he takes a lot longer to say it because it was 1908. But I think it's interesting, first of all, that he describes the Irish families as the peasantry, which is kind of a strange word to use. I would think even in 1808. It's just dismissive. He's saying, they're too stupid, I don't want to deal with them. But they all think he's mad. So why would they think that? They don't speak English. He doesn't want anything to do with them. Supposedly. Why would they have any... And how would he know what they think of him? Which sounds like paranoid delusions, right? And he says, the reason they think I'm mad is because I want nothing to do with them. I've cut myself off from them. Which all just right off the bat sounds like a dude with delusions of grandeur and paranoid delusions who just thinks everybody's out to get him. But also, if the Irish village really does think that he's mad, there's probably a good reason for it, because they've probably dealt with a lot of weirdos. Like, why would they in particular think he was mad? Now, if you read the text, and I can't help but do it anymore this time. So I can't remember how obvious it is upon first reading. So if any of you are reading or just read this recently for the first time, you have to tell me how obvious it was. So his sister, his spinster sister, is an interesting view into what's really going on, to my thinking. So every time that something happens that the recluse describes, his sister acts as though nothing has happened. And then he'll like shake her and be like, why aren't you reacting? There's these swine things that are trying to break into the house. There's, I've dug into the pit and there's swine things under there. The dog is turning into a mushroom. Why are you not acting crazy? And it's this classic, like, if you read it, it's this very classic, like, abusive relationship where he's crazy and he's trying to get her to justify his delusions. He's constantly telling her, he's either like, I lied to her, but she surely knew what I really meant. Like, he lies to her about Pepper gets wounded at one point by one of the, according to him, one of the swine things. So he tells her it was a wildcat. And then in his mind, she knows what's going on, and she's the crazy one because she never admits what's going on and never speaks in plain language and is never like, hey, Bob, or whatever the hell your name is, what's going on with those pig monster things? She's always acting like nothing's going on, and he's like, oh, the poor dear, she's crazy, she's cracked. She won't admit what's really going on. And then later on, she's like, so what's the deal with the wildcat that attacked your dog? And he's like, why are you still pretending like it was a wildcat? It's like, well, motherfucker, because that's what you told me. Like, he's constantly trying to gaslight her about stuff, and then he's confused that she's not sharing in his apparent delusions. So it's strange because the dog is wounded. Like, there's stuff that clearly did happen that the sister acknowledges happens. But his explanations of them are always these fantastical, farcical, supernatural things. So the more times I read this, the more I am inclined to say that the sister character, exists purely to indicate that the recluse is cracked and has gone mad. Now, if we take the framing story and say, well, why were Baranog and Tonneson so scared of the place then? And I'm like, well, wouldn't you be? Maybe it's just kind of weird to find a creepy abandoned mansion in, Ireland, which is not your place. And you've already been led to believe that these people are all superstitious and weird, and you probably kind of came here for a fun, like, trip. They mentioned the fairies a couple of times, and I don't know to what extent. I've actually heard, and I don't know if this is true, that there's still some kind of superstitious belief in fairies and stuff in places like Ireland and Iceland. But, I mean, I guess that's true of anywhere. There's still people that hew to superstitions rather closely. But presumably, especially in this time frame, the locals, the ones that the recluse calls the peasantry, would have been rather superstitious. So the frat bros from England are probably already like, ooh, we're in a fun, land where they still believe in demons and fairies and stuff. They find this strange abandoned mansion and they kind of get a chill down their spines. Like, okay, well, that's creepy. And then they read this manuscript with these ravings of this lunatic. And then they're like, that place really creeps me the fuck out. And that's proof enough that something horrible happened there. And to me, as the outside observer, I'm like, it's a fascinating story. It's a story that keeps bringing me back. And I find new facets of it every time that I stop in and check in. But I think having read a creepy-ass manuscript about a place where you are alone in the woods, you're just gonna get freaked out and back away and say, oh, yeah, I felt the presence of the evil in that place too. But see, the other thing I always wondered about this framing story was, why couldn't it have been a year later or 5 years later or something like that, right? So it's, I think, explicitly said to be 100 years later. Like, it's been a long time. They'd find the oldest guy in the village to give them memories of what from when he was a kid, of an old guy going out there. So if there was indeed some kind of horrible supernatural thing, and the house on the borderland was, defending reality or whatever, if something happened 100 years ago or 75 years ago, maybe it's 75 years, because I guess unless this guy is exceedingly old, he probably wouldn't have heard stories when he was a kid about that. So if it's been 100 years, why has the hog not returned? Why have the swine things not returned? Why does reality still exist? I the more I think about it, the more I talk about it, the more I think that nothing happened. And this might also just be the skeptic in me speaking. But also, talking about what we were talking about with Karnacki before, like, Karnacki would often find out that there just were no ghosts. So I think that Hodgson constructed a rip-roaring, quote-unquote ghost story, but really one of the first weird tales or Lovecraftian cosmic horror tales. I think he constructed that story. Then he carefully dismantled it by including a character who sheds questions on every aspect of it. So the sister character makes me, the reader, question everything that the recluse says, and makes me think that he's just having a weird time in his head. And even a lot of times he talks about how, like, I never came out of my office or I forget what he called it, my study or whatever. I'm saying that because I, like the weird recluse, am in the office. And funny enough, when we bought this house, the Air Studio headquarters here, we were talking about what to call the house, and I kind of want to call the house on the borderland, and I kind of still do, but I don't know if I want to, bring bad luck into this place or name it after a place so ill-fated, in theory. But in any case, I think that maybe the 60 or 70% of the story that we're meant to take as a freaky story, then there's another whole layer of the recluse interacting with his sister and her just basically proving with her every interaction that nothing is happening and the dude is out of his mind and probably shouldn't be hiding out in the Irish wilderness. And then there's that other layer, the framing story, that I think also adds to it, well, it's been 100 years and nothing has happened, but these guys are still freaked out by the initial story that the guy told, and they're not paying close enough attention to what's going on with the sister. They do say to each other, like, well, what do you think? Do you think he's just mad? They're both like, no, I don't think he's just mad. Which is kind of an interesting point for Hodgson to make, or desire for him to have, that we should all read things closely. Like, don't take things at face value. Read them closely. I think there's also some, like I was talking about, there's also some implications that there's nothing wrong with the Irish people, that they all treat like kids. They're just going about their lives, but you're outsiders and you come in and you're infantilizing these people. But there's no special reason to do that. They're very kind to them and they're very helpful and they help in every way that they can. But the English consistently are like, oh, you stupid, superstitious, you morons, you don't even speak English and you believe in fairies and what have you. I think that's kind of an interesting, ironic twist to say, pay closer attention to things. Don't just take things at face value, or you'll really be the one who looks like a fool. In any case, that's the House on the Borderland, according to Kazanowski. I either didn't get any comments or can't see the comments, so I apologize if you are commenting. But yeah, feel free to comment on this video on Facebook or on YouTube or anywhere else that I post it. And I'll respond in the comments. Obviously, I can't respond live at this point. But yeah, October 1st, I wanted to get you guys started off with a super creepy read. If you have never picked it up, first of all, I bought a copy, and I'll tell you why I bought a copy. And this is going to be something that I'll try and get done in the next year for French Press. Maybe it'll be a good thing to release for next Halloween. I have always wanted to do a decent audiobook of this. I would like to do it myself. Because I also want to do an audiobook of The Thing Under Your Bed myself. But I'd rather start with something else that I'm more familiar with. I know it's weird to say you're more familiar with something you didn't write. I would like to release a French... So this is obviously public domain work, being over 115 years old. I would like to release a French press. I'll probably have to release an ebook version of it just for shits and giggles. It's free. I'll make it free. But I want to make the audiobook version so I can get some practice as an audiobook narrator. That's one piece of this industry I've never really cracked or gotten into. And we spoke to our good friend Matt Wildison either earlier this year or last year about doing some audiobook stuff. So I might have to follow up with him. But I'd really like to do my own version of this. So maybe look for that for next Halloween. But if you haven't, check it out. And also, happy spooky season. October 1st, very happy to say, The Perfectly Fine Neighborhood is officially available. You can all buy your copies now. This is a great, great short story anthology featuring Candace Nola, Brian Keene, Jeff Strand, Bev Vincent, myself, Wiley Young, tons of people, some debut authors, some World Horror Grandmasters. I'm really proud of this one. It is now available as of this very day, as we speak. I got an email from KDP this morning saying, yay, your pre-order is now live, so a good solid number of you will also have that in your Kindles as of today. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm really excited about this Halloween. So much stuff going on. I'm going to be coming out to a bunch of signings this month. So check out my blog for more on that, but we'll also be sharing it here on Facebook and everywhere else imaginable. But yeah, I'll probably see you soon. Get you a signed copy of The Perfectly Fine Neighborhood. And if you see me, let's talk about the House on the Borderland. All right, thanks, everybody.